Okay, it looks like almost everybody is here. So we'll get started just in the interest of time. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to your PA Day sessions, understanding the different profiles in a classroom setting in the context of self-regulation. It's nice to see so many friendly faces. But for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jasmine Fox, and I am the Autism and Behavior Specialist for the South Region of the Board. My colleague, Kyla Guillemette, is also here and will be my co-host for the day. And she will be monitoring the Q&A and the chat feature. So just prior to our session, we'd like to mention a few housekeeping items you should know. Today's session is being recorded, and it will be available along with the slides on the eHub. So please ensure to keep your microphone muted. Please capture all your session-related questions in the Q&A function. And you can access this function by clicking on the three little dots located beside the chat feature in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Another option would be to follow the link provided by Kyla in the chat feature that will take you to a Google Doc. So we'll be leaving approximately 10 minutes at the end of today's session for questions to be answered. And if we're not able to cover all questions in that time, the remainder will be answered and provided at a later date. And lastly, Kyla and I will be taking notes to share with participants, but do feel free to take your own notes during the session. So without any further delay, we'd like to introduce you to our presenter, Dr. Stefan Bone. Stefan has many years of experience in the field of autism and in the area of self-regulation. We have been fortunate to work with Stefan on several projects in our board over the last 3 years. Today's opportunity is one example of this. He also works in many school boards in Ontario, Saskatchewan, and France, just to name a few. So now I will hand the microphone over to Stefan. Everyone, please welcome Stefan.
Good morning. I recognize faces too, so good morning. So I can share my screen now, Jasmine, yeah?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So like Jasmine just mentioned, throughout these years, the last, I'd say 20 years, I've been really working clinically about trying to figure out the different profiles that we have in the classroom. So I know we only have 1 hour, so I'm not going to waste any time explaining why I came with these profiles. I'll just show you and we can talk about it near the end. But if I start just with the scope of the problems that we've been seeing, and it's even more and more as years go by, any 15 minutes of instructional period for either elementary or secondary school in which students cause a major disruption 5 times. So how many minutes would that be? Imagine if that was 2 such students doing the same thing, that would mean 20% of instructional minutes that have been wasted. Now imagine if you do that over the school year, this would be the equivalent of knocking 36 days off of a school year. So based on that, having worked in a lot of the school system, I realized that what does differentiate a beginner student with regards to a novice and an expert is the fact that self-regulation plays a big role in the cognitive and behavioral self-regulation capacity. So most of the kids, or a lot of the kids, are not even able to work independently. So that leaves, very few opportunities for students to learn through guided practice, because when we talk about explicit teaching, we need at least some level of independence from the students. Inhibiting inappropriate behaviors, focusing on tasks, ignoring distractors, choosing and controlling relevant information, following another person's instruction, learning to use strategies to complete the task are some key elements. There's way more, but I needed to really focus on just a few. What it means when we talk about learner's behavior, we assume that the behaviors that the learner exhibits are reasonable response to what the learner has been shown and reinforced for doing. So just keep in mind that each time we ask a teacher, we ask an EA, or we ask anybody to do observation, we're always asking people, try to find the function of it. Is he seeking attention, avoiding, escaping? Is he trying to communicate something? So that's the first reaction when we looked at, students' behavior. We assume often that if a learner throws a tantrum, his response are perfectly reasonable, and that throwing a tantrum is learned solution to the situation presented to the learner. So we're starting to realize that we have way more beginners and novice in the school system, which explain why there's so many behavioral issue. So the only thing that we need to figure out is this is an assumption. It's not a fact. When we say that a student has learned these behaviors, we're not referring to self-regulation. We're just talking about behavioral engagement of a student. When we talked about really self-regulation, we need to figure out is what are the capacity for that students to engage behaviorally. That's the minimum level. But how does this child react emotionally? So once he starts into grade 2 and up, we're really focusing more on realizing that the many students don't understand the instruction. So because of not understanding, because of not having some cognition about being in school, not knowing the process of how to learn, and not being capable to perseverate on a task, not able to discriminate information, not able to engage, disengage, is really showing us that it's not the beginners are not just kids that are not motivated. They are kids that are lacking the prerequisite for executive functioning. So unless we did observation to identify that it's the instruction that is responsible, we cannot say that a child is doing or manifesting certain behavior based on seeking attention all the time or avoiding situation or trying to escape. I wanted to just clarify that before we start. So what are the different profiles in your classroom? Uh, so profile based on self-regulation, that means that you should be able to look at the social, emotional, behavioral, and cognitive skills. An expert student is a student that we call a high performer. So these students, they have high level of motivation, excellent comprehension, and great metacognitive skills. A novice student is a student that would be considered an average performer. So they need a lot of guided practice because they have a high level of motivation, but they have also an average level of comprehension. And what's really important is limited metacognitive skills. So it has nothing to do with motivation. It has to do with comprehension. And because of the average level of comprehension, the novice student has a hard time learning the metacognitive skills. And a beginner student, it's what we call a low performer. So they have low level of motivation, learn helplessness a lot of time. They just jump from one grade to the other, but they have limited level of comprehension and few metacognitive skills. So that's our baseline. That's where, after all these 25 years that I've worked with bad behaviors and all of this, this is what we start with. What does it look like in the classroom? So why the beginner low performer are more difficult to teach? Um, a word of warning to any teacher of the low performer is the minimum level of teaching skill that will succeed with the expert, high performer, will fail immediately with the low performer. If a teacher works with the low performer, a cycle of failure and false conclusion follows. So the teacher does his best and the learner fails. The teacher sees his best effort resulting in failure. The teacher falsely concludes, and I'm not pinpointing anybody, that the learner is at fault and that he is or she is unteachable, and the behavior of the learner supports this conclusion. Indeed, the learner does not learn providing the teacher with evidence that the conclusion about the learner's incapacity was correct. So that's usually how we get involved. We are looking at a student that cannot. So the probability of a low-performing learning failing a task are failing to attend. That means that student has not learned to discriminate information. That means when you're talking in front of a classroom, this student or these students in particular, low performer, really lack the ability to discriminate the information, meaning they don't know which information they will need to keep in their working memory that will help them do or complete the task. They also have limited access to the working memory, meaning that if you talk too long, unfortunately, after 5-6 minutes, the low performer, they've already forgotten everything you've said. Meaning that, and you'll recognize a lot of your students, meaning that when you try to reinforce guided practice because you want to go walk around the classroom, these are the students that you're not even moving, that they'll raise their hand and asking you to repeat, or that what do we have to do, or we're not sure what we need to be doing, because they're failing to understand what instruction means. They don't even understand the concept when you're giving a student the instruction that they should be thinking of procedure. They should be thinking already of planning based on the task that they will to do, anticipate the task will ask for this strategies. Now I need to plan how I'm going to use that strategy. So they are also failing to remember what the answer is. So even if you provide them with the correction, or if you overcorrect the low performer, and that leads to learn helplessness, are the kids that they, even if you give them the answer, they cannot take that answer and refocus and rethink about the task, the procedure, the strategy, and how you would come to that answer. So they're also failing to produce the response called for. Often they cannot, because in self-regulation, there's an element that we tend to forget. It's called effort control. When you give a child an instruction, automatically they're battling with their behavior, their emotion, and their cognitive ability to keep what we call effort control. And that's a key in self-regulation, meaning that if somebody talks beside them, if somebody else does something, that they're not disrupted by it, and that they can remain focused on what's happening. So often the low performer are kids that they're easily distracted. They can't, keep the focus on the task. They'll go everywhere. They'll add information that's not required, or they really go the wrong path. So they're not concerned with performing appropriately because they've never learned. These kids need to understand more about procedure and less about performance. So the low performer is not nearly as perfect as a receiver of information as the average performer. So when you compare a low performer, the only other population you can compare them to is the novice. You can't compare them to an expert because you're not going to get anywhere with teaching them. The low performer has a poorer memory, less interest, and less knowledge to start with. And you can't develop metacognition without having cognitive abilities. So the probability is high that the average performer would know the meaning of instructions such as tell me in your own words. The low performer, however, may fail the task tell me in your own words because he doesn't know what the instruction means. So what we need to do is also teach them the procedure, but also ask them what their understanding is. Because one of the first elements of metacognition is the ability of a student to understand what the task is. So that means they're either capable of telling you in their own words, or they're capable of showing you behaviorally, meaning they will do an example right in front of you. So that's really missing with low performer. So when we look at low performer, especially when we're talking elementary and also high school level, unfortunately, there's major issue with self-regulation. That means they can't control their behavior. They can't control their emotion because they've been failing all these years, and they've never learned the procedural way of thinking, and they don't develop flexibility, they don't develop judgment, they don't develop reasoning, they don't develop what we call executive attention, meaning they're capable of keeping only what's necessary in their working memory. And so that leads to what we call executive dysfunction with low performing students. So let's be honest here. If you don't develop self-regulation, you will have what we call executive dysfunction. So if I take the example of inhibition, inhibition is the ability to stop your own behavior at the appropriate time, including stopping your action and your thoughts. What we see with low performing students, they have difficulty waiting. As soon as you start talking or you say this is the task or after that we're going to be doing that, automatically, impulsively, they start already disengaging and they are not capable of waiting. So that means they're always looking for what we call immediate gratification. They can't delay gratification. That means they can't stop their behavior. So that means they will interrupt or disrupt group activities because they can't control their excitement level and they can't engage socially and emotionally within a group. They will start touching things or people. They will start having perseveration, meaning they will ask you the same question over and over. What do we need to do? What do we need to do? I don't understand. What does that mean? And all that, because they're stopping you from teaching based on perseveration. And then often what we see, because they did not develop what we call private speech, they will start using perseveration, meaning excessive talking. They will say out loud all sorts of things because emotionally they're out of control. So when I talked about working memory, it's the ability of the low performer to really be able to perform while keeping the information. What do we see? The student gets confused because there's way too much information presented to them. How do you manage? When I'm talking about working memory with low performer, I'm talking about pacing. When it comes to pacing, how fast do you talk? How much information do you give? And how do you make sure that that information is the right information you're asking? So what happens, because they can't do that, they will switch activity or they will never complete the task. They will just chunk it, meaning they'll start it and then they'll abandon, or they will just use some of your expectation, but they will not get to the point of completing a task by themselves independently. That's why there's a high level of dependency with low performer. They've always had an adult to beside them, telling them how to think, when to do it, when not to do it, and how to switch from transitioning to another, and all of that, organizing the material. All of this is the result of low performer not learning the skills. So they have difficulty remaining attentive because they get multiple prompts. If they don't understand the teacher, they'll look at the EA or they'll look at somebody else, or they'll just imitate or copy on another peer because they don't have this ability to for with reasoning and discriminating the information. So that means if they can't keep information in their mind because you're talking too much or you're pacing way the fast and they don't have the ability, what you'll get is you'll get many kids that are being labeled as with attentional deficit because they can't sustain their attention. That means that they can't maintain their attention despite distractibility, fatigue, or boredom. Because they don't have the skills, they're fighting every day. Self-regulation, self-control is a limited resource. So if you put all your energy just to have good behaviors, well, good luck, because that means emotionally they will react, and cognitively, well, they're not there. So that means what we see as soon in in the classroom is behavior. Their forgetfulness, they'll be zoning out, they'll make careless mistakes, they won't be able to self-monitor, they won't be able to self-correct, they won't be able to self-manage their behavior because they don't like the feeling. They're not crazy. They know that they can't compete. They know that they can't perform. So when you know that you can't perform in an environment, then your reaction is to try to get out of there or stop the teacher from teaching. So they have multiple off-task behavior. And so that leads to, inability to shift. And that's, I've talked about that. I'm looking at the time, so I could talk about this all day. But so a novice, what is a novice? So a teaching the average performer implies presenting the information clearly and with enough practice to assure mastery or habitual performance. That means a novice needs guided practice every day. You can't just use modeling. They won't respond well to modeling because they will just imitate through modeling phase. They need guided practice. That means that they need to understand all the steps to follow. And after that, they need the adult to be circulating in the classroom to be able to see where they're having issues, where the blockage is. So that means because they must compensate for their poor long-term memory. So a low performer is working memory issues. A novice is long-term memory issues because it doesn't stay past working memory because they don't practice enough. And they forget after a few days, and they forget after, for sure, after a few weeks. So that means when you evaluate them, they often will have bad marks. They must use techniques to secure attention. They must be careful about pacing, so the way you teach, and we must teach skills that aren't required when we work with the higher performer. So either you pair them up with the expert student, or you give the expert the possibility to keep up and challenge them while you're working with the low performance. So when we look at the comparison between a novice learner and expert learner, novices, they have limited relevant background knowledge. Every knowledge is isolated compared to an expert that he or she is capable to uh, use, integrate, assimilate knowledge. So every time, every day, they will think about what they've learned yesterday and what they learned the week before. A novice student is not there. So what they learned today, tomorrow when you teach them another thing, they'll think it's something different. So they don't know how to assimilate. So if you don't ask them to assimilate that information, unfortunately, they will only rely on their working memory. And expert, they rely on long-term memory because they have habituation, they have maintenance. So that means a novice really stays at more of the generalization of the skills. They'll use it, but they're not sure why and when and how come they're choosing that strategies, for example. They lack effective mental representation of successful performance. They can't anticipate, they can't project. So if you don't ask them, what's your plan? What's the outcome you're looking for, and how are you going to reach that outcome? They will not think about that naturally. The expert, they do all the time. That's one of their biggest strength is always to take one thing from a domain. You teach in French, they will use it in English, they will use it in history because they've learned a procedure, a way of working. The novice, everything is in silo. This is English, this is French, and this is how it works. So that's really important to keep in mind between the two. Novice, they only have explicit knowledge. Expert, they have huge reserves of tacit knowledge. So they can go into abstract thinking. They can associate knowledge together. Novice, they'll give you what you want. They won't expand more. They'll just be really taking everything literally. And that means if you ask me A and B, they'll give you A and B. An expert, naturally, they can give you A, B, C, D, and everything because they see the need to do it. So they go more in depth with their thinking. They're able to develop abstract thinking. They have really good skill. A novice is far from there. So it's not as if they're close to be an expert. So when somebody says, well, yeah, we've transferred a novice into an expert, wow, that takes a lot of hours. That takes a lot of opportunity for guided practice. So if there's no guided practice in the classroom, I doubt that a novice became an expert, because that's the only way they respond well. Compared to a low performer, that one needs modeling. He needs modeling from the teacher that will talk out loud, and then you'll ask them, the students, to repeat out loud what he has to do. Then you'll show him each step. Then the novice is that. The expert is they need independent opportunities to work. So problem solving requires following clear steps. So they need explicit teaching. Task analysis works well with novices. Problem solving with expert is intuitive, so they know they can think outside the box. They only see superficial details, novices. So if they have to read, for example, they have to read something and then you give them question to about it, they'll give you just superficial answer, novices. The other one, the expert, they'll see the underlying structure. They'll learn little when exposed to new information. Compared to an expert, they learn a lot when exposed to information about which they are already knowledgeable. So they expand. It's not new knowledge. It's an expansion of already some deep thoughts. They learn best through explicit instruction and worked example. That's novices. And the expert, they should be independent most of the time because they learn best through the discovery approaches. Novice are more likely to experience cognitive overload as attention is saturated with new information. And expert, they do suffer from cognitive overload. February is one of the key months, and November is the other month through the year that even experts, they suffer from cognitive overload because the fatigue is there, because they've plateaued for a while, but the expert will regain energy and is capable of keeping up. A novice sometimes will be stuck there, and a beginner, we've already lost them. So the struggling to transfer principle to new context, and also the expert will be able to transfer between domains. When it comes to inquiry, for example, novices are unsure of what question to ask, what hypothesis to generate, and how to justify their conclusions. If you look at the expert, they know how inquiry is conducted in their field. They know what kinds of questions to ask, what types of hypotheses might be fruitful, and how to search for and marshal evidence to test their conclusion. They'll find the answer. The novice, you need to guide them to find the answer. And the low performer, they have no clue what the answer is because they didn't even understand the process of inquiry. Knowledge acquisition, novices, is knowledge tends to be hodgepodge of largely disconnected facts. An expert will organize it into a meaningful pattern around key principle and concept. Problem solving, novice spend little time finding or restating problems. They look for a convenient solution or a routine question and rarely question or re-examine their ideas, or they won't self-correct, so they won't change if they have misconception, biases, or if their knowledge is incomplete. You'll get all of that when you're an expert student. Communication-wise, novices view communication as a simple telling, meaning that the expert will see communication as a cognitive tool. Then they will be able to know and looking for ways to make it both for their own needs and also for the accuracy and clarity. They will exchange with the teacher. And I've had some conversation with teacher at the high school level. How can I get some students to ask question or respond to question? You need to know when it comes to communication where they stand. A novice, for example, will just respond their interpretation of what the question means. A learner, an expert would ask you, well, is that what you mean? Are you talking about what we've learned yesterday? And they would do. And a low performer, they'll avoid the question. They'll say, I don't know, I don't want to answer, it's boring, whatever they're saying. And that's key with the difference between all of these. So just looking at time there, there's more with reflection, so you'll get the PowerPoint. So reflection is the same, one elements that we assessed. Writing, a novice student writers, they choose subject and their angle on subject only in terms of what they think the teachers wants. An expert will choose subject and their angle on subject based on their own experiences and what really interests them. And a low performer will refuse to write. A novice will delay the actual writing. They'll try to figure out what they're going to write to some detail before they actually begin writing. That's why they also don't, respect time compared to an expert. Know that it takes more effort not to write than simply begin writing. So they'll do a first copy of their work. The novice, they want only to write one copy and not having to rewrite. So they want to write a perfect paper from the first draft. So they write carefully, critically from the beginning, focusing on punctuation and exact wording early on. An expert will quickly, at the early stage, trust inner voice, expect to make mistakes. They don't worry about punctuation or words because they're looking at cognition, transferring cognition on the paper, and then they'll adjust with everything else. A novice student will try to keep all of that at once, and then so the final product is quite limited, and they are not happy with the end results. So they try to say what they think they are supposed to say, so they try to impress the readers, the novice. The expert, they're trying to find an authentic voice to write true and placed in their own experience they can start from, and so they try to inform or persuade or move their reader. So they're trying to influence the reader. The novice doesn't do that. So they have little concept of the reader as they write. They don't know compared to the expert. They will read silently because they're often very anxious. So they will read to themselves, keep their writing to themselves, compared to an expert student will raise their hand. They'll want to participate. They don't care. They'll read their work out loud. They accept, constructive criticism. They accept question and all that because they're feeding off it. So they're feeding off performance compared to a novice reader where he's just trying to please the teacher and not teach. So when I talk about cognitive overload, I think it's important for me to share that. A low knowledge learner lack what we call schema-based knowledge in the target domain. So when it comes to instructional support, would help reduce cognitive load with new tasks. If the instruction fails to provide guidance, a low knowledge learner often resort to inefficient problem-solving strategy that overwhelm working memory and increase the cognitive fatigue. So that means right after math and French class, you might see a way, some behaviors starting to appear. You might see outbursts. You might see a lot of bad behaviors because they just can't self-regulate anymore. When you look at high knowledge learner compared to low, they enter the situation with schema-based knowledge, which provides internal guidance. They know how to self-regulate. They will use inhibition. They will modulate their emotional response. So if additional instruction guidance is provided, it can result in the processing of redundant information and increase cognitive load. That's why when teachers say, well, yeah, I don't want to wait for the beginner and novice because it becomes hard for the expert. Yeah, with regards to cognitive load, if you're teaching always to the 3 level, the 3 profile in the classroom, the expert will have a cognitive overload based on the fact that the information is redundant, and they try to process that information over and over and over, and it plays on their motivation, it plays on their performance. So we should always make sure that we get the expert engaged, and then we work with the novice and the beginners. Don't wait for the entire group, because what it does, how schemas work for any human being, is they will have cognitive distortion, they will have self-defeating behavior pattern, they will have schema avoidance. So they have ways in which people avoid activating these schemas. So they'll run out of the classroom. They'll have what we call cognitive avoidance, automatic emotional response, and everything. So teaching the tree profile really means to be able to start the expert and then focused on the novice and the beginners. So the principle of instruction in our days, because of these three profiles, is focus instruction on the critical content, sequence skills logically, break down complex skills and strategies into smaller instructional units, design organized and focused lessons, begin lessons with a clear statement of the lesson goals and expectation, because this is how you motivate students. Review prior skills and knowledge before introducing new material. Provide step-by-step demonstration. That's the modeling part of it. Use step-by-step demonstration. That's also the guided practice. Use clear and concise language. Provide adequate range of example and non-example. Require frequent responses. So you need to stop, ask for feedback, ask questions to make sure that they're on the right path. Monitor the performance closely. How long can they stay engaged? Because that will explain why some behaviors happens after 10 minutes, for example. Provide immediate affirmative feedback and corrective feedback. Now wait at the end, because overcorrection will send low performer and novice into chaos, and they will start really behaving badly. So help students organize their thinking. So in conclusion, sorry if I'm talking fast, but I'm looking at time. You'll have the PowerPoint so you can look at it. Low performer makes a much larger range of errors than the high performer. The work with the lower performer has a smaller return than for the higher performer. You can't have the same expectation that are written in the curriculum. You need to be looking at self-regulation skills. You need to be looking at executive function skills. You need to be looking at knowledge. And then you need to be looking at what metacognitive skills should be. So a low learner should be all about self-control, self-discipline, emotional regulation, and hopefully we can teach them a few skills. A novice should be more about the knowledge aspect of it, meaning self-discipline, how to engage behaviorally, emotionally, and cognitively, because we need to bring them to the metacognitive level. And the expert, they already have that, so you should be looking at more promoting more metacognitive skills with regards to them. So the work, however, we guarantee the following. So the learner will learn more than would be possible with less articulate practices. The learner will have far greater opportunities following successful instruction, and the initial work sets the stage for the learner to continue to progress over years and years. So school is all about procedure. Performance is individual, procedure is group-wise. So when you're teaching to the tree profile, you should be focusing on teaching them learn how to learn. And so when we assume minimum knowledge, we make a testable assumption. The procedure for testing is to redo the instruction so that maximum knowledge is required by the learner. So you start with a baseline and then you start evaluating based on coming back to previous knowledge and asking them question, asking them, to do a specific example, asking them with a quiz, asking them whatever you want, but you need to come back to it within a period of 3 weeks. You need to come back to the first 2 weeks, because I'm telling you, low performer and novice, it's out the window. They've lost that knowledge and they will not regain it unless you start again reteaching everything. The only population that succeed through habituation is the expert learner, because they are able to self-regulate, they have good knowledge, and so they're into the metacognition skills level. So that's way easier than having to do the three of them all together. So the remedy is to rethink instructional methods so there are no weaknesses starting on the level the learner who had a minimum knowledge would perform. If change in instruction makes a change in the learner's performance, we conclude that that learner's problem was caused primarily by instruction. If change does not significantly change the learner, we may tentatively conclude that the learner's potential or aptitude caused the problem. That's when we start talking about IEPs. That's when we start talking about diagnosis. That's when we start talking about learning difficulties. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Stefan, for providing us with such an in-depth description of the three learner profiles. The principles of instruction offer us key components for considerations in our work with students, for sure. So thank you very much for that. So we'll now shift our focus to the Q&A section, as we've had a question come in. We have about 15 minutes or so left. So the first question would be, if children don't move out of the beginner stage despite our best efforts, does that lead to educators thinking there should be a referral to investigate learning disabilities or to look more at the executive functioning? Or do we just continue to try to move them from beginner to novice stage?
That's an awesome question, and I'm thankful for the person that did ask. If a beginner gets to more than 2 years behind with regards to knowledge, with regards to performance, then we need to investigate if there is no underlying issues. Once you've crossed that path of having 2 years behind, that means there's something wrong, either with regards to self-regulation, and then we could find out that easily using the brief, for example. The brief is a standardized test that identifies self-regulation problems with students, but also evaluates working memory, attention, organization, planning, and all of that. You would have a clear picture of what the self-regulation plays in the inability of that child to learn, and also which executive dysfunction are we referring to. So for me, a beginner that has 2 years behind is very, it's a red flag for sure.
Okay, thanks for that question. We don't have any more currently in our Q&A, but we'll definitely open the floor now to anybody who may have questions that have popped up for them. You are able to unmute yourself, so please feel free to either raise your hand or just unmute yourself, and we'll answer your questions. Thank you.
Maybe I'll ask a question.
Actually, I just
Oh,
saw
you heard it?
Giselle. Sorry, I just saw Giselle Bradley had a question, so go ahead, Giselle.
Basically, as to regards to a child having difficulty in learning and moving forward because of absence, is there an approach we should be taking with the child on the few days he is attending that can help us facilitate his learning?
So it did cut a bit, but I think I understand. You're talking about a child that's doing e-learning and then he shows up 1 day out of 2. Is that what you meant? What should we do with that profile?
He is not doing e-learning. He just is missing a lot of days at school.
Okay. Okay, so I think the priority with the students with a high level of absentee is to make sure that, again, and I would say that to all the learners, even if they miss a lot of school or they don't, you need to be able to assess, because any child will not develop any executive function if they don't manage their behavior, their emotion, and they don't have specific, at least basic knowledge. So I think the first step with that child when he is at school is to always try to bring them or give him activities that he's shown in the past that he's capable of doing, and see where he stands with regards to self-regulation. And because any child that misses a lot of days of school, for me, it's a red flag with regards to self-regulation, because that means the school environment is not a secure environment, and that child is capable of convincing his parents not to show up. So that means it's a child that is really lacking skills at the self-regulation level, and also that means he's able to organize his material when he's there. He's able to organize his ideas. He's able to plan. So that means tell you that how he's going to do a specific task. I don't care if he already knows the task, but it's really to question him, and based on what he gives you, you'll have a better picture of what needs to be worked, and it could also explain why he's missing so much school. So I think I would stay away from performance. You already know, because that's your expertise. That means I would try to build capacity with regards to self-regulation, meaning that if he's able to control his behavior and control his emotion, are we going to see that child coming to school more often? If that for me would be a win-win situation. And once he is in school, are we able now to teach him some of the basic skill, like, organization and flexibility, adaptation, and everything that relates to memory. So I would test his attention span. I would test also his working memory each time he comes back to school, meaning I would test him on stuff that we talked about before he missed multiple days, to see if he remembers anything.
Thank you.
Thanks, Giselle. Is there anybody else who has a question that they'd like to ask Stefan?
Yeah, I think I see another one in the chat.
Perfect. Okay. So what do you do when the parents are themselves novice learners and are in charge of helping the delivery of online learning? How do you extend the self-regulation learning to the parents?
So if the parents are a novice learner, I think what needs to happen is, when the teacher, especially online, I would ask the parents to be there at the beginning, so they understand the procedure, they understand what the task is, what the teacher is asking. So I would allow the parent at least to ask his question to make sure he or she understand what their child has to do. And then I would ask the parent to only provide the procedure explaining to their child. So I would ask the parent to ask their child to explain to them what the task is about, and I would tell the parent to leave the room for at least a minimum of 15 minutes and let the child try the task. And then after 15 minutes, I would come back in the room and assess what my child has done, because any novice learner, they need to understand procedures. They need to understand the task. They also need to understand what type of strategies were taught, and how and when and why would you use a specific strategy. So if the parents understand that, they don't need to perform, they don't need to know the content, they just need to understand the procedure, and then try to really motivate their child. They need to get out of that room, bottom line, because they're creating dependency and they're creating anxiety, because they will also often lead their child to be wrong with their work based on that. But any novice, they need some really clear understanding of the task, the steps to follow, the strategies that are offered, and it provide a clear example. So either you emailed it before in anticipation, or you show them one. So they're all looking after. Bye-bye, parents, get out of there. Leave the kid. He's the one learning. Go back to school if you want to learn about it. But that's where it stands, because if not, we're creating dependency.
All right, thank you for that question and for your response, Stefan. You were mentioning that you were potentially going to ask a question to the group, or
No,
I don't remember if
yeah,
anybody else.
I think it's for everyone there, and I'm not expecting an answer, but please make sure that you know the level of your students. Make sure you understand how many low performer you have, how many novice students you have, and how many experts you have. Experts are like dinosaurs; they're rare. So I think, we're more right now because of the high level of dependency and because of technology. They're only developing. Children today are more in tune with what we call visual memory. They get, overstimulated with everything, the information, but they're not analyzing the information. They're not reasoning. They're not learning how to use that information properly. So I think everyone needs to do, because it's sad we're seeing a high level of burnout with teachers and EAs and all of that, based on the fact that we try to bring the low performer to the high performer level. They're not working on the same thing. Some are just working on self-regulation skills, and that's the reality. I don't care if there's a curriculum or not. You're not going to force knowledge into somebody's head. Novice, they need guided practice, please, 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 guided practice. That means they need multiple opportunities where you see them act, try, and then you watch where the blockage comes in. So at least you're able to support them in small group. You can ask your colleague if you have an EA in the classroom or the resource teacher, but we should never be in a big group teaching. That doesn't exist anymore. We don't have the luxury of having all expert and novice students. We have a lot of low performer. And so I think it's more, explicit teaching is not just about, detailing and chunking the information. It's also about bringing the kids to be independent. So if you work on self-regulation and you're able to monitor, model, and also bring that child to be, well behaved socially and emotionally, you're already at the point of, independence. That might be the goal for that year. Let's not, fool ourselves here. They're not going to follow the curriculum. Same thing with novice. They might not get to the point of the entire process, all the dimension and all the expectation, but that means they can still learn. But they need more procedural. They need a lot of, I'm not going to talk about metacognition because I'm talking this afternoon, but they need to learn about the metacognitive skills. So, and it's not going to change. Because I teach university and I've got novice and I've got beginners and I've got experts. My job is to help beginners and novice. Expert, I just guide them. So that's my message.
Hey, any other last minute question? Well, we have about 6 minutes left of this session. So if there's any other questions, I think like a lot of what our classrooms are faced with is that the multiple grades that we have throughout the different and accommodating all of those beginner profiles, right? There's such a large number of those beginner profiles, rather than, like you said, experts are very rare to find kind of thing, right? So it's a struggle between those beginner profiles and having to, what's the word I'm looking for? Like bring them up, you know, like how to manage that, right? When you have to consider like the different grades that everybody's teaching as well and that sort of thing. But
yeah, I think what I can give you what I'm doing elsewhere, because in France, for example, it's all about the elite. Knowledge is power in France. So what we've done in multiple level classroom is we've let the chronological age disappear. So when we do, for example, reading group and when we do math group and all that, if they have multiple level inside, we will use the beginners from all level and they regroup together, because a beginner in grade 4 can also be quite helpful for a beginner that's in grade 2. So they can at least share some knowledge, so they can support them. So when you work with the profiles, you let go of age, and you're able to mingle, make sure that you regroup the level of performance and not the grade level. And since we've started that, we've had some great success. So it's just an idea. I'm not saying that that's what you need to do, but I understand when you have multiple, sometimes you have 3 grade level. When we're talking about, beginner and novice, novice is they need to understand procedure. So even if they do a lower grade, they still need to understand the procedure. And the other 2 profile, they need to understand the same procedure. Metacognition is not grade 4 metacognition or grade 2 metacognition. Metacognition is metacognition. Procedure is a procedure. If you do modeling, is modeling for all the kids, no matter how old they are. So if you think like that, you would have less issue than trying to compensate, because that's really hard cognitively to do with all the different levels. It depends what are your expectation and what are the competency you're looking at. There's a difference between the two. Expectation are not skills. Expectation are what you, based on your observation, based on your evaluation of your group, you think that that's what they need to focus on. And the competency, what is it? So no matter which level you have in front of you, you should be able to guide them with your competency that you're working on. The choice of activity, that's your expertise. I would never tell someone, don't use that activity. All I would do with my colleague and say, is that activity, the way you're presenting it, who are you talking to? That's it. So if you're talking to expert, good.
So we have one more question that came in here. Because there are so many low-level performers and because they struggle, how do we get them motivated to want to learn to become a novice learner? So do we, is an idea to open their mind to growth? So like a growth mindset type of strategy are we using, or do you have any other ways to find ways to motivate them?
Well, I think with bringing the low performer to become novice, first of all, you need to be working on the social emotional stability of these child. Once they are reinforced for also having good behaviors and being able to handle situation well, they automatically, the motivation gets there. And then you're able to introduce knowledge. I think once they learn the procedure, you're able to challenge them and say, wow, you're doing awesome. You know what? I'm going to give you a nice challenge. And then you give them a task that a novice would be able to complete. And then you do I explain, you tell me what you understood, I do the modeling, you show me, and then you do it by yourself, and then you reinforce. So then you would use what we call high probability activities versus low probability of activities. High probability activities are activities that they enjoy and they're good at, so you can teach procedure that way. And then low probability is when you're introducing an activity that they have not learned or that they've been exposed to, but they don't know how. So once you get the child to be able to having success on one task or the other, one or two, then you introduce what a novice would be doing, and then provide them with the support with regards to that.
Okay, and hopefully we have time for one more question. How do you balance types of learners with grade-specific standardized testing?
Well, that's an awesome question with standardized testing. I think it's just like anyone that does any evaluation. I think you need to be clear that when you use standardized tests, that you identified what the profile of that student is. Did you have to adapt? Did you have to prompt? Did you have to do anything? And then you will have the end results. So a low performer on a standardized test, I would question why they're using standardized tests on a low performer. What information are they trying to get that they don't already know with regards to performance? But for a novice, I would probably have to do a lot of anticipation with them, provide an example, and then you have to be honest ethically and get the result and say when you report it that what you've done, what have you changed with the standardized test component, because standardized testing are to figure out if you're in the norm. So if you're already not there, then why are you using a specific tool?
Great. Okay, thank you all for your questions today. This concludes today's session. We want to thank Stefan for sharing his wealth and knowledge, and all of you for joining us today. If you think of any questions at a later date, please don't hesitate to contact us or add them to the Google Doc provided. And just a friendly reminder that this session will be available on the eHub. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you at 2.
Yes.
Now I'm going on a video conference with France in 10 minutes. All right. Talk to you guys later.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan.
Yeah, this afternoon.